Good evening, everybody. I'm Austin Harney from the London South East region, speaking in a personal capacity, but also very active trade union liaison officer of trade unions, Labour for Irish Unity. And I should have said good evening, comrades, sisters and brothers, because this is a very important event tonight. It's the eve of when the largest hunger strike in Irish history started. It's some records say the 12th and some saying the 13th. I can be corrected on that, of October. But in actual fact, it was a very important event in Irish history, and yet one of the most forgotten and probably one of the most censored events in Irish history. It is an absolute disgrace what had exactly happened. Now, it was the last battle of the Irish Civil War. The Civil War was supposed to have come to an end in May, but the Republican prisoners were not released. And they were actually promised early release if they were to sign a declaration renouncing republicanism forever. Now, a vast majority refused to do that, and even if they wanted to sign that declaration, they'd have to have character references or put us as a society, which was not the case for the vast majority, for many of them who were the working poor and had nothing. It was an absolute disgrace in that respect how they were treated, so they had no option in the end but to go on a mass hunger strike to bring the Irish Free State government to account. It was absolutely dreadful. The prison conditions were appalling. I could say there were about prison in Limerick jail, 200 it was fit for, and they put about 800 Republican prisoners there in November 1922. It was similar through a lot of other prisons as well. The sanitation was absolutely appalling, and in actual fact the treatment by the Free State Guards was unbelievable as well. I could give many examples. There's even accounts, one from Mossy Harnett, who wrote about the West Limerick Brigade. He described his experiences in the Curragh of Kildare, Tintown prison camp, where in actual fact what it was, a Free State guard in actual fact woke everybody up in the morning by firing his pistol, live rounds, and in the process accidentally shot somebody. There was also many attempts at prison escapes, and there were stories of prisoners taken in front of the whole crowd, made an example of, stripped their clothes off, and in actual fact their skin was cut with the sharp bayonets as well. So the conditions were absolutely dreadful, diabolical. It's an important event for me as well because my great uncle took part in that hunger strike for 15 days. There were many other well-known people, such as Frank Ryan, who was later to lead the Connolly column in the Spanish Civil War. There was also Padger O'Donnell, the leader of the Irish Communist Division, but also deputy leader of the IRA at that time. He also too went on hunger strike. There were many great leaders who did so, but it was an important hunger strike, and a hunger strike of where nearly up to 8,000 prisoners in 123 prisons throughout Ireland went on hunger strike. That is quite astonishing, and why that is not published enough is just beyond me. In actual fact, it's so important today, as I'll talk about later, that the hunger strikers in Longkesh prison, 1981, and previous prisons, you could describe them as the resurrection of those Republicans 100 years ago who were beaten into the ground. So this is an important event for us tonight, and a night that we should remember. We should have them close to our heart, many of the Republicans who went through those appalling times and conditions. And what I'll try and do, I'll try and read from an extract here. Right, in February 1923, 23 members of Cumann na Ban, including Mary Ann McSweeney, Lily Brennan and Nellie Ryan, sister-in-law of the Free State Commander-in-Chief and Defence Minister Richard Mulcahy, went on strike for 34 days over illegal arrest and imprisonment without trial of prisoners. The strike resulted in the release of the women hunger strikers. On the 23rd of May 1923, the Irish Civil War officially ended, but the state continued to go after Republicans, keeping 12,000 men and women in prison and persecuting and harassing countless others. By October of 1923, tension was at an all-time high in the prisons and camps because of conditions and with no release in sight. On the 13th of October 1923, Michael McIlroy, officer in command of the IRA POWs in Mountjoy, announced a mass hunger strike by 300 prisoners, and it soon spread to other jails, and within days, 7,033 Republicans were on hunger strike. The figures given by Sinn Féin at the time were Mountjoy Jail, 462, Cork Jail, 70, Kilkenny, 350, Dundalk Jail, 200, Gormanstown Camp, 711, Newbridge Camp, 1,700, Tintown, that's prison camps 1, 2 and 3, in the Curragh Camp in Kildare, 3,390, Hare Park Camp, again in Kildare, 100, and 50 women in the North Dublin Union. Previously, the Free State government had passed a motion outlawing the release of prisoners on hunger strike, and Dan Downey and Joseph had died before the October strike. However, because of the large numbers of Republicans on strike at the end of October, they sent a delegation to Newbridge camp to speak with the IRA leaders there. It soon became apparent that they were not there to negotiate the strikers' demands, but rather to give the prisoners the government's message: "We are not going to force feed you, but if you die, we won't waste coffins on you. You will be put in orange boxes and you will be buried in an unconsecrated ground." The negotiations were abandoned and the strike went forward. Poorly planned, within weeks, many were going off strike, and in Cork, those who went off strike said they'd been promised that 33 of their comrades would be released within 48 hours, and the rest within 3 weeks. By the end of October, there were still 5,000 on strike. With the deaths of Barry and Sullivan, that's Dennis Barry, who was the leader of the IRA at the time, and I'll talk about them later, and Sullivan, drawing no positive response or concessions from the Free State government, the IRA command ordered the strikes ended on the 23rd of November. While the strike itself failed to win releases, it did begin a slow start of programme of release of prisoners, the state being worried about the political impact of more deaths through some prisoners, though some prisoners remained in jail until as late as 1932. Lack of adequate medical attention given to strikers, health complications from the strikes, and the deplorable conditions in which the prisoners were held led to untimely deaths shortly after the strikes of many. And that is the extract that I'm just reading. I'll just conclude with a few anecdotes as well. I mean, I can tell you that my great-uncle spent 7 months in Limerick jail before he was headed on a cattle truck to the Curragh of Kildare. That's where he went on hunger strike. But the sanitation, as I said, was appalling. They were often given an iron handle to go to the toilet, and then they would be locked in and they had to bang on the door for the Free State Guards to let them out. But it was still absolutely appalling, the sanitation, to this very, very day. When my great-uncle was released with a mass of many other prisoners by Christmas, it was 22nd or 23rd, they were all photographed. Photographs were a rarity in those days. Very few Republican prisoners kept those photographs, but he certainly kept his photograph in the attic, never told anybody. Only we discovered many, many years later on, not long ago, many years after he died. We found this photograph of him standing beside a Free State Guard, and on the back was, "This is your Christmas card, Mick Kelly." Michael Kelly was his name. What this actually meant that if he dared to defy the Irish Free State again, he would be executed. They were treated with absolute contempt and dirt, these Republican prisoners. What an absolute disgrace again. And there is a Republican who died in 2016, lived here in London for many years. His name was Michael Holden. He told me the story of when his father was on hunger strike in Kilkenny prison, or Kilkenny jail. What happened was, on the day when they ended that hunger strike, they didn't serve them food with cutlery and plates. Instead, they threw all the food in a pig's trough, and in actual fact, all the Republican prisoners had to scramble for it. So it was very sour grapes on the part of the Irish Free State government when they had to start releasing those prisoners when the hunger strike ended as well. But what it did tell us, that when that mass went on hunger strike, their spirits weren't broken. And that is very, very clear. They were to tell future generations that we must strive for Irish unity, which we are doing to this very, very day. We will push for it one way or another in the 21st century. We will make sure it's going to be there, and we're going to seek justice for all our forefathers who went the whole way. And I'm making quite clear that all the history books, they say it was a waste of time, the propaganda, it was an absolute disgrace, they denigrated them, but they will be proved wrong when we stand up, us future generations, and we will unite Ireland once and for all. I'll just conclude that it was my great-uncle, he raised a toast in the Irish Civil War, and he said, "We are the regular irregulars," because that's what they were called, the irregulars. They were treated as outlaws. The message is quite clear, that the Free State government and British imperialism, you can break us, you can beat us into the ground, but you will never break our spirits. We'll come back in the next generation and the next generation afterwards. I will say solidarity to all the Irish Republican prisoners of 100 years ago who went the whole way and are an inspiration to all of us and all our future generations. Solidarity once again.
Okay, Corja Gael Porcheroka, you, Valera, and you. You're welcome here this evening to commemorate the last great hunger strike of the Irish Civil War. It's important to remember these events. It's also more important that we learn the lessons of it, both for today, because the Irish Civil War, there are lessons to be learned. There are lessons to be learned from the War of Independence, and the legacy of that is still around to this very day. The Irish Revolution was defeated, and it was driven into the ground, but it rose up in further generation to continue the fight, which continues to this day. But we must remember that the Irish people from all parties tend to blame themselves for the partition of Ireland. The primary responsibility for the partition of Ireland, which was a crime against the Irish people, and a crime, strangely enough, against the Protestant people of Ireland as well, was due to the British imperialism. They were going to divide Ireland come what may, and people in hindsight have tried to impose a united Ireland, that was part of the struggle. It was and it wasn't, because they were never at that time going to get a whole 32 counties. They already decided years before they were going to partition Ireland and divide Ireland. But that got written in afterwards as something of violence. So even if they had to preserve unity and become a unified government, they would have ended up with a 26 county state. What they did from there on would have been quite different, I imagine. But what happened was the revolution got defeated, and what happened then was a very right-wing government took over, which linked up with a right-wing church, and they oppressed the Irish people. So we had not just oppression from the British Empire and colonisation of our land and our territory and our people. We had colonisation of the soul and the mind from Rome as well, because the church imposed upon the Irish people almost suppression, which Irish women paid for in great deed, and Irish children did over years and years and years. And we're only seeing now the final breakthrough in a lot of those issues over the last 20, 30 years, really. Now, going back to the Unionist community, because I think people have mislaid in time and history, and they've imposed with hindsight different things upon. If you go back to that Protestant community in Ireland, they were for an independent Ireland. And even you go back to Grattan's Parliament, and even the Act of Union, one of the main opposition to that was actually Protestant people. And even in 1921, the Unionists within the 26 counties, that part of it, wanted to stay within Britain. But it was the orange card, which was played by Churchill's father back in the 1880s, and then again played by Churchill himself when he imposed a civil war upon the Irish people. And I'm a great supporter of Michael Collins as a freedom fighter, but I have no time for Michael Collins when he became counter-revolutionary. When he crossed the Liffey to attack the Four Courts, he became a counter-revolutionary. And even in my own county, where we had General Sean McKeown, it was the same thing. When he became responsible for the Noble Six in Sligo, when they shot them dead up on the Sligo Mountain, the people revered him as a freedom fighter during the War of Independence, but we didn't accept what he did in the Civil War, and that remained me as a kid growing up. So we need to take the lessons of history, that the Civil War was imposed upon the Irish people. It was a proxy war on behalf of British imperialism. But the problem is we took that guilt of that Civil War on us for generations instead of trying to overcome and leading the fight. Now, what did the Free State do with their independence? They reneged on many things. They reneged on the finest thing, which was our culture and our language. Now, you get in the state of Israel, where they brought back the language within 10 years. Despite De Valera's and everything, they never brought back the Irish language. The Irish language was problematic. It was seen again as a guilt thing. And even after the Civil War, there was this great silence in Ireland. Now, there was a different silence in Ireland after the Great Hunger, which was a different thing. But people didn't want to talk about the Civil War and the War of Independence. So you couldn't get it from the people. And it was only in latter years. And that's why the century of commemorations is important, because we can go back and learn the lessons, and things that were hidden can come out, really. But the primary thing that happened with British thing was the colonisation of the mind. And what hasn't happened in Ireland is the decolonisation. That's why in Ireland they allow this post-colonial thing, where the Irish Free State was always looking over his shoulder and said, yes, master, ain't we doing right? Ain't we doing all right? And you still got it with the West Bris and the Dublin media, that even to this very day, they're still looking over their shoulder to see if they're doing the right thing. And you get this realignment in Britain, where they want to realign with the British monarchy, which is wrong. We have a king who lives in luxury in Buckingham Palace, on the benefits of the enslaved black African people. And now today the main agenda here in Britain is the history of empire. Now the Irish need to be first and part of that history of empire in the rediscovery of that. Now there's been elements here in Britain to leave the Irish out of that debate. Now if you actually look at the invention of the white race, that was built on the subjugation of the Irish people, what they did in Ireland. Everything they brought in from Gerald of Wales in the racialisation of the Irish people. They lifted it from there and imposed it upon African people around 1600s onward. Before then, there was no such thing as a white person, but there was Irish. And there was no crime to kill an Irish person. There was no crime to do what you want, take the lands, the possession, everything. So the Irish are central to this modern debate about empire. But time and time, the BBC and all the academics tend to leave Ireland out of it. So we need to push that back into the centre of it. I'll finish soon because I don't want to keep on too long tonight. The problem is today that we have in Dublin and in Northern Ireland as if they're riding two horses. But the two horses are partitioned still. And we need to find a way forward where we have a united Ireland. And it's not going to be given. We get Union Jack Starmer, who had a conference with a Union Jack background. I thought it was a National Front conference when you looked at the picture. The membership of the British Labour Party is now a Union Jack, it is. And he says that if there's a referendum in Northern Ireland, he's going to campaign for Britain to stay within the Union. Now that's wrong, and it's unlawful in terms of the Good Friday Agreement. So we need to challenge what is happening there. But the fact that Britain will give up Northern Ireland just like that, it is a fight, and we need to remember that. We need to remember the lessons in 1921-22 and the War of Independence, that this is a united struggle. We need to bring everyone together, and we need to move away from where the Protestant people have been imprisoned within a racist state of Northern Ireland, which was set up by British imperialists and supremacists to trap them within a northern state. So the only way out forward for them was to dominate another minority. Divide and rule, colonisation, but that will be breaking through. And I think in the end, the Protestant community and the Unionist community will discover the true roots, which is 1798, and being part of an independent Ireland, which is better for them, better for the children, better for industry, and better for their lives. So I'll leave you with that we are together still as a people. We are still fighting. We've learned some of those lessons, and we need to continue strong until we have a total free, united, and hopefully a socialist Ireland. Thank you.
Friends and Republicans, welcome here this evening. We have gathered here this evening to remember an event in Irish history at the end of the Civil War, where over 12,000 men found themselves incarcerated in various prisons throughout Ireland. And what they were left with was to make a decision. Were they going to accept the situation, or were they going to bid some way for their freedom? So as usual, Irishmen put their bodies on the line. But if we go back a little bit, the first Irishman to die on hunger strike was the man from Lisbole in Dingle, County Kerry, Thomas Ashe. Thomas Ashe had been on hunger strike before. Thomas Ashe died in 1917, but he was imprisoned here in an English jail in Lewis in April, and he embarked on a hunger strike for political status. Also, the man that joined him on hunger strike in Lewis jail was Eamon de Valera. Now, a lot of people may not know that. There are not too many fans of Eamon de Valera around. But Eamon de Valera joined him on hunger strike. But because at that time during the First World War, the Americans were about to enter the First World War, the British were courting the Americans to come in, and they didn't want bad publicity. So they released Thomas Ashe, Eamon de Valera, and another man called Thomas Hunter. Eamon de Valera wasn't out very long, and he was elected in East Clare. In July, he was elected in East Clare on an East Clare by-election as a Sinn Féin MP. Now, he was one of the first Sinn Féin men to be elected in East Clare. And as a Clare man, I'm proud of that. So the boys in East Clare decided we have a mandate to start drilling, and they started drilling openly. The RIC rounded them up, and they ended up in Mountjoy. In Mountjoy that time, the OC for the Irish Republican Army was Austin Stack. And they went on hunger strike in September of 1917. Now, Thomas Ashe was a big man, big frame. He was a strong man. And within a week, they started force feeding the prisoners. There was 38 men on hunger strike, including Thomas Ashe. And Thomas Ashe was taken out of his cell, walked out of his cell, taken to a place where he was being force fed. Thomas Ashe had a big wooden clamp put into his mouth. They've done the same in this country too. And they've done it again, the suffragists as well, where they force fed him. And that's a very dangerous thing to do, is to force a tube down somebody's throat. And it was done by men that weren't really qualified to do that. Thomas Ashe suffered a lack of air and blockage to his lungs. And that evening, Thomas Ashe died. So the hunger strike was called off a couple of weeks after that. That was the 1917 hunger strike. 3 years later, 1920, Terence McSweeney in Brixton Prison died on hunger strike. So did Michael Fitzgerald, another Cork man, died in Cork, and Joseph Murphy. 3 men in 1920. We go to 1923 is why we're commemorating here this evening. And again, 12,000 men locked up, decided we'd put their bodies on the line. Now sometimes it's referred to as the only weapon they had. I don't like to use that word, because going on hunger strike is not a weapon. It's a decision you make, and you have to be of clear mind to make that decision, because the possibility is you will die. The Irish government at the time was not going to give in. And in October, started middle of October, by the middle of November, Dennis Barry, a Cork man from South Cork, had died. And also a man from Cavan, Andy Sullivan, died. And it started to fizzle out after that. Now Dennis Barry was buried in the Curragh. They wouldn't give his body to the family. So after a few days, through some court order, the body was released to the family. There was a bishop in Cork called Bishop Cohalan. Now the Catholic Church had rode in behind the new Free State government. And as Pat said earlier, as right-wing and as conservative as they came, they refused a Christian burial for Dennis Barry, and they told every priest in Cork not to give him a Christian burial. Now, Bishop Cohalan had walked in front of Terence McSweeney's coffin 3 years earlier, 1920. And he was the big man walking through Cork City in front of McSweeney, went into St. Finbar Cemetery and gave a beautiful service inside in the cemetery, buried McSweeney. And he wrote a week later in the Cork Examiner the sacrifice McSweeney had made. What an honourable thing. He compared him to Wolfe Tone. He compared him to Padraig Pearse and the other executed leaders of 1916. That was 1920. 3 years later, he denounced Dennis Barry and said he should be excommunicated. The Catholic Church in Ireland, the same as the Catholic Church throughout Europe, they always tried to pick the winners. They had picked the winners in the likes of Cosgrave and Higgins and the rest of that cabal who executed 80 men during the Free State, during the time of the Civil War. But Bishop Cohalan and the likes of him, and they're still around today, they try to pick the winners in any situation. That's telling you a little bit about Cohalan. I won't say much more about him. So moving on, that was the period of 1923. We had Devil Air and Power, 1940. Tony Darcy, a Galway man, died in Mountjoy in 1940, along with Jack McNeil 2 days later, November 1940. Jack McNeil was a Mayo man, Tony Darcy, Galway. And in 1946, Tyrone man Sean McCaughey died in a hunger strike. I think it might have been Portlaoise. And we move on into the 70s. And the recent struggle for our final green field, the struggle for our independence in the north of Ireland. When the Irish Republican Army decided to take the war to London, we had a war going on in the north of Ireland. Michael Gohan from Mayo died in Parkhurst Prison, June 1974. 2 years later, Frank Stagg died in Wakefield Prison, 1976. 5 years later, you will all remember the hunger strike of 81, when 10 good men died in the H blocks of Longkesh. And I'm wearing a badge here tonight. Some of you might see it. It was given to me by Bobby Sands' sister, Marcella Sands, when she came to London 2 weeks before he died. And first up in 81 was Bobby Sands in May. He was followed by Francis Hughes, Ray McCreesh and Patsy O'Hara, Joe McDonald, Kevin Lynch, Kieran Doherty, Thomas McElwee, and last but not least, I forgot one man, Martin Hurson. And the last man, the 10th man to die, was Mickey Devine, INLA man, a dairyman. Now, I've quoted the names of 22 men who died on hunger strike. We must remember the women from the Cumann who went on hunger strike. Mary McSweeney, who spent 45 days with her brother at Brixton Prison. But we also must remember the men who died when the glare of all this had died down. The men who suffered during hunger strike, they did. Some of them died weeks later, months later, years later, from the period of 1917 up to 1981. Hunger is we all have had a day we might have been hungry. It's not nice. But a hunger strike does an awful lot to deteriorate the body. And we must remember them. Now, I'm going to finish now very, very soon. I would like to remind you, we have an event happening at Brixton Prison on the 29th of October. It's our annual event to remember Terence McSweeney. You'd be all very welcome to come along and join us. We will next June, on the 9th of June, we will remember Michael Gohan, and we will go to Parkhurst Prison. He has never been commemorated. It's the 5th anniversary of his death. Just put it in the diary if you're around on the 9th of June next year. So with that, I thank each and every one of you for joining us here this evening. I thank Austin Harney for organising this event. All these events must be remembered.
Solidarity.
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 Solidarity.